Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlotte and this is Charlotteshelves. This video is part 2 of a bookshelf tour with me. In my first video I walked you through a lot of the literary fiction and classics that I love that are on my shelves, and then this video is all the thrillers, horror, true crime and sort of non-fiction works that I love to read. My taste is kind of split down the middle, a bit like my shelves, where the top section is the classics and lit fic and history stuff, and then the rest of this is pure horror and true crime and thriller. Also, please like, comment and subscribe because it really helps my channel. I, like a lot of people on booktube, really like Grady Hendrix. My favourite Grady Hendrix is the Final Girl support group, and when I watch people film like Grady Hendrix books ranked, this is never like even in the top 2, but for me, I thought the pacing on this was so good. Slasher movies are also one of my favourite types of horror movies, so I think all the little tropes and nods to slasher movies in general were really appreciated, and I really like this. I would say Southern Book Club's Guide is a 3, Best Friend's Exorcism is a 2, but then How to Sell a Haunted House was a 4 for me. Horror Store, I really read it on Kindle, so I missed a lot of the layout things that made it unique because it's written kind of like an IKEA catalogue. It's very interesting how he plays with sort of style and form. I also recently discovered Nick Cutter, who is a horror author I'd like to read more of. I think The Troop is a 5-star horror book. It's kind of contagion body horror and it is really unsettling. I think I gave this a good 5 stars. I really like Josh Malerman. Bird Box was one I only read in the last year or so, and he's someone that I now want to read all of their works. I also really enjoy Stephen Graham Jones. He's someone that was new to me probably in the last 2 or 3 years, and is again someone whose works I would really like to read all of them. Sealed is one I read last summer and is one I always recommend. Really fascinating horror novella, kind of pandemic virus themed. My best friend gave this to me and it has special memories because it was part of a book calendar that she made me in the summer. So this just reminds me of reading really gruesome, again this is kind of body horror too, over one very long, very hot summer, and I loved this. This was a 5-star read. This is also a really good example of like female horror writing. I try to read, I think horror is very male dominated anyway, like a lot of the horrors that I do love are like Stephen King and Grady Hendrix and people like that, and this is a really good example of someone I think is going to be a really promising female writer in that sphere. So Stephen King is one of my favourite horror writers, but I think overall my favourite horror writer, although they haven't written half as many books as King, is Max Brooks. I love World War Z, that is a 5-star horror to me, but it's one of my favourite books of all time, and also Devolution, which he published I think in the last 4 or 5 years. I lost the dust jacket for this. This is also a 5-star read because basically these people go to a little holiday community and I think a volcano explodes and traps off part of the forest where they would normally leave to exit this holiday park. So they have to stay in this sort of eco-friendly community and wait for help just to make sure that they aren't in the way of the volcano, but they can't drive out of it because the pathway down the mountain is blocked. And whilst they are holidaying, they start to realise someone is stalking them while they're at this sort of community, and they start to realise things aren't what they seem, and it just builds and builds and it becomes quite the survival narrative. I think it's phenomenal. I don't see people talk about this half enough, and I would recommend this as a 5-star. I also have this collection of short stories by Max Brooks that are all zombie related and they're incredible too. I used to have so many Stephen Kings and they aren't all here anymore because of the great mold disaster of 2024. Cell is one I read more recently that I enjoyed. I really liked Christine. It is my absolute favourite Stephen King. I would love to get a nice hardback edition of that and try and set on one particular style of King's to collect rather, because I think it looks really great when people have all the same particular editions of King. I have a copy of Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It was really heavy, don't judge me, so I tore it in half so that I could carry it around with me and keep reading it so it looks like a right state. But this is nearly, is it 1,000 odd pages? Yeah, it's crazy, but this is a really wonderful short story. This is a wonderful short story collection, and this is probably the work that I would recommend anyone who is new to King to start with, because there are so many types of short story within this that I think you get a real sense of his writing across multiple types of genre, but also multiple types of horror work. And for that reason, I think it's a really insightful way of like understanding his writing and the types and styles. A classic horror, I Am Legend is always really special to me because this was one of my late grandfather's favourite books. It was one of the few books that as an adult we bonded over. This is very very depressing. It's a very bleak book, and I just had such wonderful conversations with him about this particular text and bonded with him a lot more over just sci-fi and horror works that I just didn't know he loved. Tiny Nightmares is a short story collection, but it's like micro short form. Some of them are only a page or so long, and they are so fun to read through. Like the economic use of form in this anthology is incredible. So if you want really punchy, like short, sharp shocks, I would recommend this. I had to get it on eBay. I don't see it often here in the UK at all. My copy is ex-library, but would really recommend. Next, we have Station 11. I read this in lockdown, and that was probably the worst time, or possibly the best time in which to read a literary fiction, horror, pandemic-themed novel in the midst of a pandemic. Like, if you weren't already feeling anxious about coronavirus, reading this really did up the angst. I think if I was to have read this for the first time, not living through a pandemic, it probably would have been less profoundly upsetting, but I still really recommend this. This was a 5-star read for me. This is one I know that everyone has probably already read, so I won't bore you with talking what it's about, but this is incredible. 5 stars. I have a sort of subsection within my horror of female horror writers that are kind of writing about pandemics or contagion or sort of dystopias. I appreciate they're all like little subgenres, but I really also love Naomi Alderman. She writes incredible dystopian kind of, I don't know if you'd class them as horrors. There's certainly plenty of things that are distressing in them, but this is a really great book. This is much slower paced than The Power, which is what I think she's predominantly known for, but I still recommend it. I think I gave this a solid 4 stars. Next, I have a very dystopian horror type classic called Make Room by Harry Harrison. I put this on a video of one of the top 10 most distressing books that I'd ever read, because it is such a bleak depiction of what is our very likely future environment going to be like due to due to environmental disasters basically. And this kind of predicts a lot of what is already happening in terms of our planet and the environment, and also how people are climate refugees and how civilization starts to break down as a result of ecological disaster. So 5 stars, incredible, but one to avoid if you are not in a good place mentally, because it's quite upsetting. It made me feel very helpless and small. I have a couple of George Orwells, but also a book that is kind of, I don't know how you would categorise this. It's called Z for Zachariah, and I had to study this in secondary school, and it was the first time I was ever introduced to the concept of a nuclear holocaust. And as a teenager, that left me down, I think it was an Ask Jeeves wormhole of asking questions about what nuclear fallout was and all the kind of things that come with nuclear radiation. And this book prompted me to really scare myself, looking more into nuclear disasters and Chernobyl and I think 3 Mile Island and all the other things that I started trying to learn more about. But it is told through the eyes of a person who is potentially the last person left in this little valley that has been preserved in the mountains, and one day a person shows up and they might have radiation poisoning or they might not, and I believe they're a lot younger. I think the girl is probably like a late teenager trying to learn how to build a little society again on her own, and then this man comes along and it's kind of a tussle between the two of them, like can she trust him, can she not? And the whole backdrop of it is this nuclear holocaust, and it is also equally distressing to read about, especially when you're a teenager. I also have some fun and generic thrillers by Ruth Ware. I think One by One is my favourite one of hers. That's a in a cabin, snowy mountains, business trip, lots of people, they all start getting picked off one by one. Fantastic, really enjoyed it, probably a 5-star thriller for me. Then I have some Lucy Foley, who I also enjoy. Gillian Flynn is probably one of my favourite thriller writers. And then I also have this horror anthology, which I talk about all the time. It's Out There Screaming, and it was curated by Jordan Peele, the director, and it's got so many incredible writers. I will put, I'll show you the back so you can see who's on there. The anthology is called Out There Screaming, an anthology of new black horror. It does touch on topics to do with racism and sort of post-colonial works, but it is 5 stars. It's 5-star horror. Like, these are short stories that will stay with you and linger. I also have this really nice 40th anniversary edition of The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. This is one I do see on people's reading lists for most upsetting books that they've ever read, and I agree, it is disturbing. There are certain twists and things that I don't know if I've just destroyed my brain and my little black heart, but I was not as traumatized as I think some people are with this book. There are aspects of violence and some really messed up things that go on within it, but I don't know if it's quite top 10 most distressing things I've ever read. But I do enjoy this book. It is dark, it is also bleak, and it it's creepy. It's just a creepy little book. Like, you have some more thrillers in the form of John Grisham. There's a sort of handful of them here, the ones that I've kept that I like to reread. And I really love the Camino Winds, Camino Island trilogy that has been more recent. I would say my favourite Grisham is it The Partner? I think that's, yeah, that's probably number 1, and then Runaway Jury might be number 2. Those two are like comfort reads to me. I especially like to read a John Grisham in the summer. It's one of those that's quite a nice holiday read too, if you want a entertaining but not too fluffy, like something that actually has more substance and plot and quite good research in it. And if you already know Grisham, you know this, but he used to work in the legal sector, so that informs a lot of his work. Most of them are legal or crime or courtroom type dramas, and he's so good at pace as well. I do love the slow burns, but the faster ones like Runaway Jury and Partner, what's the other one I read recently? Pelican Brief is also really great. All of those were 5 stars for me. I have a fictional retelling of the Lizzie Borden murders that has only like a 3.1 on Goodreads, but I read this years ago and really enjoyed it. I thought the reimagining of, like, if you believe she did it, I thought this reimagining of it was incredible, and I've recently just repurchased this copy, although it doesn't have the dust jacket, which is a pain, to reread to see if I still love it just as much. My next smaller section is on true crime. I used to have a lot more true crime, but again, the Great Mold Outbreak meant I had to chuck quite a few of them away. It really hit a lot of my, older, pulpier paperbacks, but one that did survive is The Zodiac. I also talked about this in my Most Distressing Reads book. I think this is one of the greatest true crime works of all time, and whether you believe who Graysmith posits as who they think the Zodiac is, it's still really interesting to read because he was intimately involved in the events that were happening at the time. Graysmith was a reporter working at the paper he was a cartoonist that was working at the paper when the Zodiac was writing those letters and notes in, and he was interviewing all the people and the detectives around this period, so he was so involved. And like I said, even if you don't think Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac, fascinating to read. I also have a copy of I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara. I also have this on audiobook. It was my bedtime story for many months. I think her writing is wonderful, and it's such a shame that she didn't live to see this be published. She sadly passed away before it was on the shelves. I also really like the writing of Caitlin Doty, or Doherty, depending on how you pronounce it. I had another one of her books which is also more to do with the history of different death practices amongst other cultures. That one was really interesting too. I also like reading books on sort of pathology and forensics. I had a few more of those before they went. I had Smoke in Your Eyes. I had another one, I think it was by Carla Valentine. I also really like Dr. Richard Shepherd. He is a leading scientist here in England, and he covered a lot of really interesting true crime, or well, real crime cases, that he was I think he was is it pathologist, the correct title? I have a handful of Ian McEwan's. He is probably one of my favourite writers. My favourite book by him, which I don't have a copy of, sad face, is Enduring Love, and I'd like to get a nice edition of that. That's my favourite. I have 2 of his short story anthologies here, The Cement Garden, which I think was his first novel, and The Children Act, which is a later one. Children Act is really good. I think I gave that a solid 4, but Enduring Love is a 5-star, and I also really liked On Chesil Beach. I have a book called Stasiland, and I went through a brief hyperfixation of reading about the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also what was going on behind it, and the GDR, really, that sort of period of history. I thought it was fascinating that there was a microcosm of a world within Germany, within itself, and learning about the history around this and the differences between the East and the West was fascinating to me. And this is a collection of stories, or I would say more like interviews between people who lived behind the wall, and this writer was one of the first to sort of go behind the wall and actually interview and talk to people, and it's fascinating. It's so revealing, and like the Stasi were part of this surveillance state, but there's stories of hope in here too, and I found this to be really insightful, and it just led me down a whole wormhole of this period of history that I'd learned nothing about, and I thought it was fascinating. So this is also a 5-star. Some of the thrillers that I'm also realising I'm missing are by Dean Koontz. He's another lighter read, sort of lighter thriller that I really do enjoy. He wrote this book called Demon Seed, which is a thriller about essentially an Alexa device before Alexas were made. I think this was published in the 80s, 1973. But basically it's set in the future where everyone has these little boxes, like an Alexa with a screen, in their house, and they can talk to it like a computer, and it can do commands and things for people. And one day it becomes sentient to one of these people, and this girl is living in a house, and she is then trapped by her robot, her Alexa device essentially, and it's a survival story of can she escape from the Alexa device that she has given up so much of her life to. Like, the house is largely automated by it, the music and all the things we use Alexa for, basically she has surrendered to this device and then is imprisoned by it, and that's a really great story. It's also quite prescient because this was written 50 odd years ago and this is literally a reality now. Not that our Alexas are quite imprisoning us yet, but my other favourite Dean Koontz book that I would love to get a copy of is Winter Moon, which is an alien horror book, and it's so unsettling. It's definitely one of his better written ones as well. I would recommend that one. I think I gave it a 4.5, maybe I don't know if it's a 5, but it's one of those that has definitely remained with me. This biography by Caroline Fraser is one of my favourite books of all time. It's so incredibly well researched, and I really appreciate the detail and the devotion that is in all these details that she has combed to pull and reconcile together. So if you are interested in that period of history, I also think this could be really fascinating to you because, like I said, it's so well researched. But also if you love Laura Ingalls Wilder, like, this is probably one of the most definitive works on her life. Also won, what did it win? I'm sure that this won the Pulitzer the year it came out for biography. It was that highly esteemed, and I think deservedly so. It's incredible, and that's actually quite a nice book to finish this video on a 5-star. If you have made it this far through my rambly bookshelf tour, thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed chatting through some of the horrors and the thrillers that I love today, but also some of the slightly more miscellaneous odds and sods that are also on these shelves. If there are any books in here that you particularly enjoy yourself, do let me know in the comments because I would love to chat about them with you. That's one of my favourite things to do, and I'm so grateful that you could spend some time here today with me whilst I share what's on my shelves.